Please be seated. The record will show the presence of the jury, the defendant, and all counsel. Dr. Samuels, the jurors have some additional questions for you. In your office, do you have books that you would willingly offer to patients free of charge?
Yes.
Are you able to view external information in this case, such as websites, news broadcasts, or any other medium?
I have assiduously avoided any contact with the media.
Did Jodi tell you that she had purchased a gun in July of 2008 intending to kill herself?
No.
Did she tell you about a plan to kill herself with a razor in jail?
No.
What is the difference between covering up and creating an alternative reality?
Covering up is a voluntary action. It's creating an alibi for yourself. The alternative reality is a psychological process known as a defense mechanism, and it occurs through subconscious forces. The individual who is so afflicted by that oftentimes is not even aware of the depth of their distortion, of their cognitive distortion.
Follow up, Ms. Wilmot.
Doctor, with regard to the defense mechanism that
Yes.
you just talked about, the defense mechanism, is that's part of creating an alternate reality?
Yes.
And when somebody creates an alternative reality, does that help them to not have to deal with what the reality is?
Correct. It insulates them from the feelings associated with the worst part of the trauma.
Okay. And when this happens, when our minds use this as a defense mechanism to avoid thinking about what really happened, is there often associated with that acute stress?
Yes.
How is that associated?
Well, it's the stress that's driving the distortion, the creation of the distortion. Once the stress is removed, very often there's no need for the distortion any longer, and the client is better able to face reality.
Okay, so saying that, if the stress is removed, let's talk about specifically with Jodi, then if the stress of June 4th of 2008 is removed on June 5th, then why is there this defense mechanism occurring when she speaks to Detective Flores in the beginning, or when she's sending an email to Travis?
Well, the stress isn't gone just because the next day occurs.
Okay.
She hasn't dealt with it. She hasn't processed that. There are still gaps in her memory as to what happened. But the fact remains that as long as a person is in conflict and is dealing with such repressed feelings, the possibility of this alternative reality developing does exist. In its most extreme form, it would take the form of a dissociative identity disorder, but that was not the case here, but that's the best example that I can give.
Okay, so you said as long as the person is still in conflict.
The person is in conflict, the person is still experiencing distress, the person is still experiencing the physiological effects of stress. Yes, it would very likely sustain that defense mechanism.
Okay, and so is that something, would you consider Jodi still being in conflict when she's not able to deal with the fact of what happened on June 4th? Is that the kind of conflict you're talking about?
Yes, it is.
Okay, so can somebody be in that type of conflict then until the point of years, even years?
Oh, it can happen, yes, it certainly can happen.
All right, and when Jodi eventually, when Jodi eventually came out of this conflict and was able to actually tell you and tell her attorney what happened on June 4th of 2008, how did she feel?
Objection. Characterizing, actually.
Sustained.
When she told you what she says actually happened on June 4th, and the times after that, how did she feel about being able to release that information finally?
Same objection, actually.
Approach, please.
When Jodi talked to you about what she says actually happened on June 4th of 2008, and times after that, how did she feel about being able to release that information?
She told me that she felt as if a tremendous pressure, a tremendous weight had been lifted from her shoulders.
And is that further evidence or is that further support for you of a defense mechanism versus covering up?
Yes.
When you were speaking to her about, whenever she would talk to you about the thoughts of killing herself, okay, that's what we're going to talk about for a second. If she would have given you a plan that she actually had a plan to do, what would you have done with that information?
Well, if a client gives you a plan for suicide, then you must take immediate steps. And depending upon the circumstances, you would contact the appropriate individuals. That could be, if they're at large, it could be a family member, it could be their doctor, it could be an emergency suicide line. In case of the jail, had that occurred, I would have contacted the jail authorities, the medical department, and alerted them to this possibility, as well as her attorney.
And if she would have talked to you about the fact that she did actually have a plan to kill herself and was going to use a razor and went so far as actually trying to cut herself so that it was something that she did do, if she had told you that, is that something then that you would have had to have been on alert for with the jail?
Absolutely.
And when the jail goes on alert that somebody, an inmate, might actually be might actually try to commit suicide, do you have knowledge as to what the jail is going to do with that person?
I do.
What do they do?
Well, they put the person on suicide watch, where they're monitored every few minutes. They would have a consult with the psychiatrist. Medication evaluation would be done, possibly placing the individual on antidepressant medication, although antidepressant medication doesn't begin working immediately, but at least it would be initiated. And mostly they would be very closely observed and probably placed in isolation.
All right, and so when you talk about being closely observed, that means they lose any semblance of privacy that they might have.
That is
right?
Correct.
And when you talk about being in isolation, that means they lose any type of social interaction.
Objection made.
Sustained.
Do they lose any type of social interaction when somebody is placed in isolation?
They have no social interaction.
Okay. And when somebody is placed for suicide watch, do they also take everything away from them?
The person is, yes, everything is taken away from the individual, sometimes in extreme cases even their clothing, although I don't know that that would be the case here, but nonetheless, everything that is potentially a risk is taken away, so you're really isolated.
So when you talk about that in some cases they'll take their clothing away because potentially they can strangle themselves, right?
That's correct. They can hang themselves with their clothing.
And so hang themselves. And so that's why they would take their clothing away.
That's right.
In your experience with what you've seen happen to people who have any type of a report of a plan of suicide, is it somewhat humiliating for the person?
Objection not to be on the scope of the question.
Sustained.
Judge, may we approach?
You may proceed.
So if there's any report of suicide, the jail takes it seriously. Is that what you're saying?
Very seriously, yes. They do a good job.
And what they do to somebody after that report can be dehumanizing.
Objection meeting beyond the scope of the question.
Overruled. You may answer.
The consequences can be somewhat dire for the individual, as they are always suspect of engaging in potential suicide behavior again. There may be changes to their living arrangements. Sometimes, I know of cases, again, in the men's jail, I don't know so much about the women's jail, but where they're placed in isolation after that. So the outcome is not predictable.
All right. And you said you were asked a question about when patients come to see you in your office, if you've ever given them books.
Oh, yes.
And is that something that you do?
Well, that's just the way that I did my work. I would buy a carton of books that I felt were appropriate, and especially in cases where individuals couldn't afford to buy the book, I would give it to them to help them get started in their self-help aspect of their therapy. And similarly, when I did evaluations for people, because I could not serve as a therapist, I would sometimes give them a self-help book if I felt it would be useful for them. That would be just something that I did in my practice.
All right. So people who come to see you in your office, you said that you would give them a self-help book and that would be part of therapy?
If they came to me for therapy, it could be, yes.
Okay. And if they came to you for therapy, is that something that then you would follow up with them during their therapeutic sessions?
Oh, absolutely. And we would use the book perhaps as a guideline for some of the therapeutic interventions. They would have homework assignments based upon books and workbooks. There were a lot of books, not just one. And they would be given homework assignments that sometimes were key to the book and sometimes not key to the book.
Okay. And then with evaluations that you're doing where you're not doing therapy, did you also give books to people who you were doing evaluations for?
On occasion, if I felt it might be helpful to them.
All right. And did you ever follow up with those people when it's an evaluative
Never.
process? Okay. All right. Thank you. Nothing further, Judge.
Martinez, follow up.
Sir, did you gain some knowledge from some other area since our cross-examination? Did you? In the area involving the jail?
Did I gain some knowledge?
Yes, did you go out and do some research?
No.
Well, do you remember we were talking about the book and your gift of the book to the defendant? Do you remember that?
Yes.
And do you remember that you blurted out during cross-examination, well, she was suicidal? Do you remember saying that?
Objection is characterized as testimony.
Overruled.
I didn't say she was suicidal.
Didn't you say that she wanted to commit suicide?
She said that she did not plan to be around for the duration of this process.
Are you saying, sir, that you didn't use the word suicide when we were talking about the book? Yes or no?
I don't recall. I may have, but I don't recall.
Yeah. And if the record reflects that you did use the word suicide, sir, would you have any reason to doubt that?
Objection argumentative.
Overruled.
No.
So if you use the word suicide with regard to the issue involving the book, do you remember that I then followed, or the prosecutor then followed up and said to you, well, did you report it to any of the officers in the Maricopa County jail system? Do you remember me asking that?
I do.
And do you remember that you told me back then, well, I don't know anybody to report it to?
Objection, Judge. Can we also have the prosecutor not yell at the
I'm going to object to the speaking objection. She can.
Sustained to the speaking objection. If you wish to approach, you may.
Okay, then can we approach?
Did you tell us at that time, well, I don't know who reported to at the jail? Do you remember saying that?
At the Durango jail, I did not know who to report it to, and there was no need for me to report it because there was no plan. However, had there been a plan, I would have found out who to report it to.
Bottom line is you told us that you didn't know who to report it to at the Durango jail, right?
I've never had to report it there.
I'm not asking you about that. Isn't it true whether or not you've had to report it? You came in just now and you started to tell us all the procedures involving how to report a suicide at the Maricopa County Jail, didn't you?
At the male jails, yes, because I've had experience with that.
And I'm not asking you about that because you weren't asked about the male jails in the follow-up, were you?
Yes.
You were asked about Miss Arias. Don't you remember her asking you that?
Yes.
She wasn't asking you about the male jails, was she?
But I used that as an example. I qualified my answer.
You didn't say that.
Okay, I thought I did.
Objection, Judge. Mischaracterizes his testimony.
Overruled. You may answer.
You didn't say that, did you?
I'd have to see the transcript.
So, with regard to this issue then, are you saying that you lack the knowledge to know at the Maricopa County Jail when it involves a female as to who you reported to? Is it yes or no?
I don't know the specific person. I know what procedures to follow, but I've never had to do it there. So I would have had to find out who was the proper person to report this to.
At the Durango Jail,
At
right?
the Durango jail.
Actually, there's a problem with that because the defendant stays at the Estrella Jail, doesn't she?
Well, then it's the Estrella jail.
Well, no, it's not just well. Isn't it true?
Sustained.
Isn't it true, sir, that the Maricopa County jail system only houses female inmates at the Estrella Jail?
Right, which is on Durango Street, so I'm sorry I got it confused.
Did I ask you where it was?
No, but I'm explaining my answer.
Right. No, you said that it was at the Durango Jail, right?
Excuse me, I meant the Estrella jail on Durango.
There is also a Durango Jail, though, isn't there?
That's correct.
And so you knew that, right?
Well, of course I know that.
Beyond the scope.
Overruled.
And so now you know, when you were asked about it in terms of the suicide issue, you now know that, or you're now telling us, or told us before, that you would go to certain personnel at the Maricopa County Jail, yes or no, if the defendant had indicated true suicide, right?
Yes.
Now, sir, the other thing that you were asked about was about the books that you may or may not give to people, correct?
Correct.
At your office. Those books that you indicated are self-help books, right?
Correct.
By definition, self-help books involve treatment, correct?
No, they involve self-help.
And self-help is not to better the person?
Well, it may be to better the person, but they have to engage in the effort to help themselves. They don't have any external help from me if I'm not their therapist.
That's not, let's do it this way, it's not for the purpose of assessment, those self-help books, are they?
Not for the purpose of assessment, no.
And with regard to this issue about covering up and creating an alternative reality, the bottom line in this case, not the bottom line, covering up involves not telling the truth, correct?
Yes.
And creating an alternative reality, by your definition, also indicates not telling the truth, right?
Well, not telling the truth to me implies that the person has voluntary control over the story they're telling.
And I know that you want to say that, but
Objection. Argumentative.
Sustained.
yes or no, isn't it true that creating an alternative reality is talking about something that's not truthful? Yes or no?
Yes.
I don't have anything else.
All right, Dr. Samuels, you may step down. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to ask that you go back to the jury room for approximately 5 minutes, and the next witness will be in the courtroom to testify. Please remember the admonition.